Welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure as General Secretary of the International Council of Christians and Jews to welcome you on behalf of the ICCJ Executive Board to our webinar, Interreligious Dialogue about the Land, Development and Diversity. I especially welcome our speakers, Philip Cunningham, Adam Gregerman, Ruth Langer, David Neuhaus, Jesper Swartvik, and Deborah Weissman, who are enabling not only the realization of this webinar, but also dialogue about the land. The ICCJ owes special thanks to them and the other authors and members of the research group for making possible the publication of the new ICCJ book, Enabling Dialogue About the Land, a resource book for Jews and Christians. I deeply regret that once again, and obviously for the longer term, we cannot meet face to face. Mostly all of us gathering now online are compelled to stay at home. Group meetings are not allowed and traveling is not possible and also not advisable. But although the Tel Aviv airport is closed, we invite you to a virtual, intellectual and interreligious journey to the land. So welcome aboard to more than 150 travelers from all over the world, from, according to the participant list and an alphabetical order, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Cameroon, Canada, Czech Republic, Egypt, France, Germany, Great Britain, Hungary, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Norway, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Romania, Sri Lanka, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States of America. For some of you, it's early in the morning or the middle of the day. For others, it's prime time, and for some, even late in the night. But I guarantee all of you a journey without jet lag. On flights, it's not allowed to enter the cockpit, but at our journey, you are cordially invited to send messages and questions to the pilots by using the Q&A function that you can find below on your user panel. And now, enjoy a drink, fasten your seatbelt. It's time to leave the floor to the speakers and the captain, our moderator, Adam Gregerman. Dear Adam, boarding completed. We are ready for takeoff.
Hi, thanks so much. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. As today's moderator, I want to welcome you to our webinar on interreligious dialogue about the land, sponsored by the International Council of Christians and Jews. I am Adam Gregerman, Associate Director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations and Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I am one of the contributors to the book that is our focus today, Enabling Dialogue About the Land, a resource book for Jews and Christians. It was published in 2020 by Paulist Press. Realizing the challenges posed to Jewish-Christian relations by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the ICCJ supported a multi-year research project for scholars to consider how to foster a healthy interreligious discourse around this topic. The goal was not to solve the conflict, but to promote interreligious understanding between our communities. An international group of scholars came together annually for study and discussion in Europe, Israel, and the United States. They then contributed essays and curricular resources, which have been gathered together in this volume by the editors, who are some of our speakers for today. The book has two parts. First, it presents a collection of essays that provide much background information and explore various aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Second, it includes a primary source-based curriculum to guide small group interfaith dialogue. Although the book provides insights from many different perspectives, primarily on religious questions, it is impossible to include all the relevant points of view in a single volume. Likewise, today's webinar also presents only a sample of the viewpoints contained in the book. In our webinar, we will hear first from a Jew and from a Christian who contributed to the book about how their religious lives are impacted by living in the land of Israel. Then we will try to provide a sampling of the essay section with the book's 3 editors about the religious meaning of the land of Israel in different traditions. In the coming months, the ICCJ will be offering online facilitators training sessions about how to use the small group dialogue resources. After the presentations, the speakers will have a chance to dialogue, and then we will turn to your questions. In the first part of our program, we will hear from Dr. Deborah Weissman, past president and special consultant to the ICCJ. She will speak on living Jewishly in the land. Then we will hear from Dr. David Neuhaus, SJ, of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. His presentation is titled, A Christian Life in the Wounded Land. Debbie, I'd welcome you please to speak first.
Thank you, Adam. I am honored to have been part of the book and now on the webinar. I want to congratulate Phil, Ruth, and Jesper for editing this volume, and congratulations to the Paulist Press for getting it out during this pandemic time. I also want to thank Annette Adelman, the General Secretary of the ICCJ, for organizing the webinar. My contribution to the book and to this webinar is a little bit different because I felt we needed to focus not only on the land, but also on the state, the land of Israel and the state of Israel. And I have found that a frequent stumbling block in Jewish-Christian dialogue can be that Jewish identity isn't only, and I would say for many Jews, myself included, isn't primarily a religious identity, but rather an ethnic, cultural, and in some cases, national identity. And so for many Jews, our connection with the state of Israel may be at least as important as our connection with the land of Israel, or certainly with theological perspectives on our connection with the land. I have lived here in Jerusalem for the past 48 and a half years. And here I feel my religious, ethnic, and cultural identities come together. And to tell you the truth, when you speak about living Jewishly in the land, I feel wonderful about it. I love Hebrew language and culture, celebrating Shabbat and Chagim, the festivals. Purim is later this week, and the whole country is celebrating, or really more than 80%, because there are many, many stories about Arab children asking their parents if they can also dress up for Purim. Here in Israel, we Jews have assumed responsibility for all aspects of life, from self-defense to collecting the garbage. Now, Robert Frost said, home is where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. So an important part of our connection with the land is that it is a refuge for Jews, a country built by refugees and Holocaust survivors, where each and every individual has his or her own story. Some people have even called Israel a living laboratory for Jewish values. It's a spiritual center for the world Jewish community. It's the only Jewish community in the world with a positive birth rate. It's a place that's full of the study of Jewish texts and traditions. The arts in Israel culture are infused with Jewish sources. And I want to mention something that you might not all be aware of. I am not a Reformed Jew, but I'm delighted that it's very likely that we will have a Reform rabbi in the next Knesset, because he is number 4 on the labor list, and it seems that that's a realistic position. So there's been positive developments even in the area of religious pluralism and diversity, at least within the Jewish community. But because we have resumed responsibility, our problems are deep and deeply disturbing. Reality always falls short of ideals. Many of our problems are normal problems of developed and developing countries, but there are also specific challenges. One, we never really thought that anyone except Jews would want to live here, so we never bothered to develop a policy of immigration. We haven't worked out well the relationship between religion and state, nor have we worked out the tension between a Jewish state and a democratic state. But having grown up in the 1960s, I was brought up to think that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So I came here to try to be part of the solution. And what I would say is that on the Jewish side, I feel life here is deep, rich, meaningful, largely satisfying, with tensions and challenges, but tensions can be creative and challenges can be inspirational.
We're going to next turn to David, and I'll address our speakers today by their first names. I hope that's okay, though they're all distinguished. They're also, I like to think, all friends. He's going to speak on the topic, A Christian Life in a Wounded Land. Please.
So I would like to begin by, again, thanking the editors of this wonderful collection, very much needed, I think, in our interreligious dialogue. So thank you very, very much, Jesper and you, Ruth and Phil. And I'm very honored to be one of those that was asked to write an essay, which is more a personal essay. A Life in a Wounded Land is the title that I gave to it. And before I start in on the implications of living in the land for someone like me, as a Christian living in the land, a citizen of the State of Israel, I will say immediately that one of the things I love about living in the land is living in the same land as Debbie and being engaged with her in dialogue, conversation, and friendship. And so in this spirit, I will begin to say the following points that I think are absolutely essential for me as a Christian and perhaps for many, many Christians who live in the land. So I would start with saying that the most wonderful thing about living in the land when you are a Christian is that you are living in the land of Jesus. I live just a few hundred meters away from the Church of the Resurrection, and being able to go there and enjoy the absolutely pulsating energy of the center of our faith is one of the most incredible things that I try always to transmit to my students born in the land. They often take that totally for granted. Of course, that opens up into the reality of living and being a breathing part of the Mother Church. The Church was born here, and we can never forget that. Of course, now we live in a very, very interesting circumstance. Since 1948, we are a Christian minority living in a society in which the Jews are the majority. Our brothers and sisters who are Jewish are the majority in the state. And in a certain sense, I don't want to romanticize or dehistoricize, it gives us a sense that we can make our own of being in a similar situation as the first century. Of course, that opens up into another incredible circle, the privilege of living in the land of the Bible. This is the land of the Bible, and being on a mountaintop or next to the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, or walking along the coast allows us to bring the Bible alive in ways that are not possible for most people. So that's another very significant part of living in the land. Point number 4, of course, is living in the land where we are in constant relationship with the Jewish people. And this, of course, has its ups and downs. The newness of being a minority living among Jews who constitute the majority. And I would say, Debbie, perhaps this is another great challenge for Jews to get used to the fact that they are the majority, the dominant majority, and have incredible power over the lives of those whom are minoritarian, is something that has a new reality for Jews in the world. And sometimes we who are not part of the Jewish majority might in fact start to think that Jews need to do a training course in being the majority, taking responsibility fully for the fact that they are in control and their decisions mark our lives. Point number 5, which is a very important part of my article, is this is also a land that is called Palestine. And here I'm not talking so much about politics. Maybe one day this will be a land composed of 2 states, Israel and Palestine. Maybe it will be one land. Who knows what the future is? But in fact, there is a whole level of this land that is Palestine, where Palestinian Arabs live, whether they are citizens of Israel or under Israeli occupation, and the realities of occupation and discrimination are an integral part of the daily lives of everybody. Of course, those that suffer under the rule of occupation or the regime of discrimination, for them it is a living reality day to day. And for me, very, very important as well to underline is I started with the incredible privilege of living in this land as a Christian, and the privilege also of living in a land where dialogue with the Jews is not an option. It is a daily reality. But I would add to that as well, that for me, very, very significant in my own story, and it has made me grow as a person of faith, as a Christian, as someone coming from a Jewish family, is the day-to-day encounter with the Muslim world in this land. This is also an integral part of the Muslim world, and very important for us as Christians, for us as Jews, is the Arabic civilization. So all of these threads weave into a story that I tell in the book, and which really shows the joys and the sorrows of living in a land that is profoundly wounded, but that is a land ultimately of hope. And so really my plea and my wish is that this book would lead us from wound to hope, and finally to reconciliation in a country that incarnates more than it does justice and peace. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David, as well. We appreciate hearing really distinctive perspectives that you bring on a topic like this because of your personal connection, of course, with the land and the people who live there. Our next 3 speakers are our 3 editors. We will first hear from Rabbi Dr. Ruth Langer, who is at the Theology Department and the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. Her presentation is titled Israel in Jewish Theologies. Second, we will hear from Dr. Jesper Svartvik, Corcoran Visiting Chair in Christian Jewish Relations, also at Boston College. He will present on Israel in Protestant Theologies. And third, we will hear from my colleague, Dr. Philip Cunningham, at the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Joseph's University, and immediate past president of the ICCJ. He will speak on, as you may have guessed, noticing a pattern, Israel in Catholic Theologies. I'm going to ask Ruth, please, to join us in presenting first.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to share my screen. So my task is to speak about Israel in Jewish theologies, which means to cover about 3,000 years of Jewish thought in 12 minutes, which is obviously important. So this is going to be a synthesis, but a slightly different synthesis that I gave in the book itself. The parts are all there in the book, but in somewhat different ways. So about 3,000 years ago, according to the Bible, King David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it his capital, bringing to it the most holy object of his people, the ark containing the 10 Commandments from Sinai. His son Solomon built on the city's highest point a magnificent temple to house that ark. By the 7th century BCE, this became the only legitimate place for Jews to offer their official worship of God. Deuteronomy speaks of Jerusalem as the place chosen by God to dwell among humanity. But shortly after the cult was centralized, in 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquered the city, exiling its leadership and demolishing its temple. Psalm 137 records the pain of this moment. Al naharot Bavel sham yashavnu gam bachinu, v'zochrenu et Sion. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. For the psalmist, Zion, one of the hills of Jerusalem, indicated all of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself symbolized the entirety of the land at whose heart it stood, and in many, many ways still stands. The psalmist in exile mourned for his home, unable to utter its songs, vowing to hold on to this grief, even in times of joy. The exiles were able to return from Babylonia after about 50 years. As soon as they could, they rebuilt Jerusalem and its holy place. Herod the Great, the Roman puppet king, a cruel man with what some described as an edifice complex, immensely expanded and beautified the temple itself. This is the place where Jesus joined his fellow Jews in worship, except that one Passover season, almost 2,000 years ago, the Romans crucified him just outside the city walls. A few decades later, the Jews rebelled against Rome, and the Romans sealed their victory by destroying Jerusalem and its temple. Once again, Jews were exiled from this holy city and from the mountaintop chosen by God for the divine earthly dwelling. This exile fundamentally shaped subsequent Judaism. Theologically, this exile still exists, even though the thriving modern state of Israel suggests a significant modification of it. How did this exile from Jerusalem shape Judaism? First, Jerusalem and its temple remained the geographic center of the Jewish world, a particular land called Israel, special to a people called Israel, even in the absence of a state called Israel. The Bible itself records this role of place, of space in Jewish thought, beginning with God's covenants with the patriarchs in Genesis. There, God promises to Abraham and reiterates to his son Isaac and grandson Jacob, himself renamed Israel, not just relationship, not just multitudes of descendants, but critically, God also gives them as a permanent home what comes to be called the land of Israel. Judaism takes this promise seriously. At the same time, there are multiple biblical definitions of the boundaries of the land, so we need to understand the land as more a concept than a concretely defined entity. However, its general location on or near the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, south of Lebanon and north of Egypt is clear. Rabbinic tradition teaches that when the Romans destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews from Jerusalem, God's indwelling presence, God's Shekhinah, remained on the temple's western wall. Probably, this teaching did not originally apply to what we think of today as the Western Wall, which is the retaining wall of the Herodian platform, depicted in this old photo, but to the shrine itself. But it came to apply to this one accessible part of the platform's base. Here in a recent photo, actually a screenshot from a camera broadcasting continuously. This was last night. Note the vast plaza cleared to create a huge outdoor synagogue. From the same website as this camera, one can send texts of prayers to be placed in the wall's cracks. The rabbis taught that when praying, Jews, wherever they are, should direct their hearts to Jerusalem and to its holiest locus. As this text's conclusion states, the purpose is that all Israel, all Jews, will direct their prayers to a single location. This determines the orientation of synagogues and the direction even of private prayer. This centrality of Israel has shaped Jewish practice in myriads of other ways through the centuries as well. The land's centrality is not merely geographic. Jews understand that the Messianic age lies in the future. Central traditionally to these expectations are a restored national life in this homeland. Key elements of this are iterated and reiterated in the traditional daily weekday prayers, asking that God gather in the exiled Jews to the land, restore sound, divinely appointed, just political leadership there, and return the divine presence to dwell in a rebuilt Jerusalem and its temple. Each of these elements is very complex, especially in the modern period, but they shaped Jewish hopes for 2,000 years. That itself makes them important. Jewish liturgy is full of prayers expressing these hopes. Indeed, once one is alert to this theme, it echoes constantly. It is rather obvious that it would dominate the summer fast day, the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the destructions of both temples and associated with dozens of subsequent tragedies of Jewish history. But it is less obvious that a prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem would pop up in numerous day-to-day situations, like in the grace recited after a meal, or in the blessings over a prophetic reading. Much of this follows the prompt of Psalm 137. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. A profound expression of this is in the Jewish wedding celebration, which in its totality is an expression of immense, overflowing communal joy, not just in the love of the couple, but in the hope, the optimism for the future of all of us that the new household embodies. Fundamental to the ceremony itself, but also recited for the couple at the conclusion of the feasts that follow that day and for a full week, the 7 wedding blessings express this most clearly. Thematically, they tie the joy of the first wedding, that of Adam and Eve, you can see the green, to the anticipating joy of weddings in Messianic Jerusalem in purple. Zooming in, we see that the 5th blessing even praises God explicitly for bringing joy to the barren Jerusalem, i.e., the city whose children have been exiled, bringing joy by gathering them in again. Then the 7th blessing, mustering a superfluity of synonyms for joy, anticipates that the intense emotions of this wedding will only be a foretaste of the joy that will fill the streets of Jerusalem in Messianic times. But we are not at that time yet. So a Jewish wedding takes a moment at the very end to recall that reality. Traditional weddings, and these pictures are from my daughter's wedding, end with singing from Psalm 137, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem," to a somber melody. Some couples put ashes on their foreheads as a mark of mourning at this moment. Then something, often a glass, is broken to remind us that our joy, however great, is not complete. And note that this also serves as the moment of transition to full party mode. There is much, much more that can be said. I've focused on older theological traditions, but all these shape the dynamics and complexities of today's Israel. This is a real, living, breathing, seething place today with modern cities and ancient, here the walled city of Jerusalem, with beautiful new civic architecture, magnificent private homes, and slums, with religious zealots and secularists, with Jews and Christians and Muslims, with dreams of peace and experiences of terrorism. It's also a place where one finds pop artists using the Bible to comment on modern culture, and where widely differing crowds gathered in pre-pandemic times for gay pride parades, for political rallies, and even in pandemic times for political protests for other reasons, or for funerals of leading rabbis, this in the last month. It's a country where living in or striving for coexistence is often a daily matter, where finding peace is a constant and real challenge. But peace, too, is a major part of the Messianic hope, and hence a central theological value. In other words, Israel, land, people, and state, is a complex place and a complex society. Its Jews come in all sorts, its people come in all sorts. Israel and Jewish theologies must be in the plural in the past, and all the more so today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ruth. We're going to next hear from Jesper on Israel in Protestant theologies.
Thank you. Before addressing my assigned topic for today, the Protestant churches and the land, I would like to explore another issue. What is Protestantism? It's a movement which has neither popes nor patriarchs. Some of the denominations do have bishops, but other denominations, Presbyterians, take as the starting point of the self-understanding that they prefer the title elder over against bishop. Protestants do not have a single holy tongue comparable to Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, or Latin. Quite the contrary. The importance of hearing and reading the Word of God in the vernacular is often emphasized. The Bible is certainly central, but the ways in which it is interpreted are almost as numerous as the words it contains. Many handbooks and websites state that Protestants stem from the movement that began with the 95 Theses published by Martin Luther, but some of the reformers were born and even died before 1517, for example, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. The importance of the grace of God is another possible self-definition. But for the grace of God, I'm alive, I thrive, and I survive. But not only Protestants talk about chen v'chesed v'rachamim, charis, and gratia, even if I'm inclined to argue that we Protestants tend to do it more often than most other Christians. But of course, on the other hand, not as often as Muslims and Jews. So what then is Protestantism, and who is a Protestant? The road towards a definition I choose today is via negativa, the road of negation. At times, it is easier to say what something isn't. And a Protestant is a Christian who isn't a Catholic Christian, and neither an Orthodox Christian nor an Oriental Christian. This definition not only keeps my introduction to a minimum, which our moderator may appreciate, it also captures something pivotal about Protestantism, that Protestants like to protest. In the words of Martin Luther, Wenn ich eine Predigt tue, so mache ich eine Antithesin. When I prepare a sermon, I make an antithesis. The original protest, of course, was against abuses in the sales of indulgences, but the hermeneutics of protesting keeps being central. As most ICCJ members know, and therefore I need not dwell on that topic, this has been detrimental in so many respects to the development of Jewish-Christian relations. Too many Protestants still believe that Christianity is the opposite of Judaism, be it the law versus gospel dichotomy, or retaliation versus love, or tribalism versus universalism. And that takes us finally to today's topics. Protestants like to protest, and many Protestants believe that it is necessary. The necessary approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is an agenda of reformation. They are convinced that the Protestant is needed, desperately needed, because there is an inherent imbalance that can only be corrected by Protestants. This is, I believe, a characteristic and striking phenomenon. Regardless of the political agenda, be it pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, the typical Protestant motivation is that there is a one-sidedness in media, in politics, in their own congregation or denomination, and this bias has to be corrected by Protestants. That is not something that Jews, Muslims, Oriental Orthodox Christians, or Catholics can achieve. Only a Protestant can detect it and address it. And Protestants like to protest and do their bit for balance. So whenever and wherever archetypical Protestants look, they find sales of indulgences, although in disguise. Some of you may think that such a self-understanding does not give much room for constructive self-criticism, and I agree. People who think of themselves as balanced in a world of omnipresent and inherent imbalance seldom look at themselves in the mirror. Now, before moving on to the political positions of various Protestant denominations, allow me to mention something that's well known to most of you, but perhaps not to all who attend this webinar. The word evangelical is used in two different senses, which may cause some confusion. The German word evangelisch means that the person or the congregation belongs to the Protestant movement, the Reform movement, as it's also called, with its emphasis on key issues in the good news, Greek evangelion. That is how the word is being used for in Sweden. My own denomination, Church of Sweden, is an evangelical Lutheran church. However, the German word and the Swedish word as well, evangelical, is also translated into English as evangelical, but in a narrow sense, referring only to evangelical Protestant denominations, which typically have a distinct focus on the Bible, more often than not, presented not only as inspired by God, but also inerrant. In other words, all evangelicals are evangelical Christians, but not all evangelical Christians are evangelical, which I can assure you is confusing to many. And in this presentation, I will use the word evangelical in the narrow sense. Now, Protestants' approach to the land ranges from the evangelicals in the narrow sense now to the liberal churches. Some Protestants interpret the founding of a Jewish state as a prophecy fulfilled, and others think of it as a theologically problematic enterprise altogether. In theological discourse, some Protestants interpret the birth of the state of Israel, if I may, as an immaculate conception, and other Protestants think of it as the offspring of original sin. These two extremes highlight the degree to which the Israeli-Palestinian controversy is constantly fueled by and fuels theological discourse. While evangelical Christians' enthrallment with Israel, the people, the land, the state, is notorious, undeniable, liberal Christians too show a remarkable interest in Israel, in particular in the discussion of the many imperfections of the state of Israel. Their respective foci are quite different. Liberal Christians are primarily concerned with the predicament of the Palestinians, whom they rightfully perceive as the underdog. Conservative Christians are more often than not fascinated by the victorious David of Israel, who fought and defeated the Goliath of the surrounding Arab nations in 6 days, as a recreation of the 6 days of creation, followed by a 7th day of rest. What these two Christian groups have in common, however, is an extraordinary interest in the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians. And this particular geographical region has become integral and indispensable to the Christian universe. Not only do we find among Christians a valid critique of either the Palestinian Authority or the Israeli government, depending on their theological persuasion, but also an almost ritualized condemnation of their chosen whipping boy, be it the Israelis or the Palestinians, and a lack of constructive self-criticism. Now, on the one hand, we find among Protestants those who identify with Pope Pius X famous non-possumus to Theodor Herzl in 1904, when, quote, "We cannot," non-possumus in Latin, "we cannot give approval to this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it," unquote. On the other hand, we also easily find contemporary Protestants who, like Daniel Deronda, dispatched by George Eliot at the end of a novel to the land of his newly discovered patriarchs and matriarchs, encourage and provide funding for Jews to make Aliyah. Hence, we encounter within Protestantism the widest possible spectrum, spanning from non-possumus to possumus, from "we cannot" to "yes, we can." One should note that the theological landscape has changed. Today, we find a non-possumus theology predominantly in the Protestant tradition, while possumus theology, of course, found among those evangelical Christians often referred to as Christian Zionists. And I must add that I cannot but be struck by the fact that some of these Christian Zionists seem to be ignorant or even nonchalant about the plight of their sisters and brothers in Christ in the land. By way of conclusion, 2 points in particular should be underscored, both of which Father Michael McGarry addresses in an article published in 2005 in a book on Jewish-Christian relation. He lived and worked in Jerusalem for many years, and I believe he's with us this evening, afternoon, morning, and this tonight. He states, first, the centrality of the land in Jewish self-understanding is not up for debate. Arguments for disinheriting Judaism are certainly not the way forward if one seeks a dialogue based on knowledge, respect, and trust. Supersessionist theology will not help to ease political tensions. And secondly, and this is no less important, one should not equate this central element of Jewish self-understanding with support for the views of one party or another in the current political landscape in Israel. Christians should neither delegitimize nor sacralize the state of Israel. I wish that some of my Protestant sisters and brothers, to a higher degree than now, were able to integrate Father McGarry's points into their theology. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. There is a time to protest, hoping that others will listen to you. There is a time to listen to what others have to say. And seeing with 2 eyes gives you a better perspective. Listening with 2 ears gives you a more nuanced understanding of the dual narratives of both Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm inclined to suggest that today Protestants primarily need to protest against their own prejudice and polarization. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Lastly, I'm going to call on Phil to present, please, on the topic of Israel in Catholic theologies.
Thank you, Adam. And before I start, let me just say that when we were organizing this webinar, we wanted to give everyone a sort of taste of the diversity of views, limited though they may be, within the book. And I hope you'll all agree that my predecessors speaking this afternoon have really showed some wonderful diversity and insights and the richness that can be gained by having these kinds of interactions. With that, let me share my screen, please. It'll take me a second to get it to the right point. So as was said, I'm going to try and speak about how Israel, the state and the land to some degree are understood in Catholic theologies. And let me just use as a starting point the very sweeping observation that for most of its history, the Catholic Church for the same reasons as was true of other Christian communities, tended to delegitimize a continuing spiritual connection between Jews and the land of Israel after the coming of Christ. Something that distinguishes the Catholic Church today is, through the vicissitudes of history, the Holy See is an internationally recognized city-state that enters into treaties and exchanges ambassadors with many nations. It established formal relations with the State of Israel beginning in 1993. And so this gives a kind of different angle for the centralized Vatican teaching authority to interact with the birth of the Jewish state in 1948. In terms of theology, which is our focus today, the longest ecclesiastical text for Catholics on the subject of Israel is a single paragraph in a 1985 document, Notes on the Correct Way to Present Jews and Judaism in Preaching and Catechesis in the Roman Catholic Church. That document urged Christians to understand Jewish attachment to the land of Israel, that the state of Israel should not be seen in any particular religious way, and that the Jewish people remain a chosen people. Now, the development of a Catholic theology of Israel today, which many people are undertaking in their own ways, I'd like to suggest has to be undertaken within four basic parameters or four principles that are part of the religious teaching of the Catholic Church. The first of these parameters is that the Bible is the Word of God written in human language. Put this another way, Catholic Church understands that interpreting the Bible is an interactive process between the faith of its authors and the faith of readers today. It's the interaction of the faith of the biblical authors in their particular context with the faith communities of today, in this case, the Catholic community, is what constructs the meaning of the text for our lives and inspires us to be better Christians and to follow Christ more fully. Now, the consequence of this is that answers to theological questions about the land of Israel cannot be resolved by recourse to the Bible alone. There are many other factors besides what the ancient writers wrote that must be taken into consideration. And this, I think, distinguishes how the Catholic Church finds meaning in the Bible from how some other people do. For example, Jesper mentioned evangelicals in the narrow sense, sola scriptura Christians, for whom the Bible alone is authoritative, will have different points of view than Catholic teaching would be comfortable with. The second parameter that would form Catholic engagement theologically with the land of Israel is the idea that God's revelation is relational. What this means is that acts of God's self-disclosure require human beings to respond to that disclosure in order for there to actually be revelation. I'll give a very mundane example. You might have three people that observe a magnificent sunrise, and one of them may be moved to feel that they're in the presence of the holy as a result of this beautiful spectacle. The other two people may have no such feelings at all, may just simply say they're observing an astronomical phenomena, or another might say, gee, I'm hungry, it's time for breakfast. In other words, for there to be a divine self-disclosure, a decision of faith is needed on the part of human beings. Now, what this means in terms of the land and the state of Israel or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that religious truth claims that are based on revelations are of their nature subjective experiences of the transcendent that may or may not be shared with any other groups. People outside of a particular group's religious culture will be unmoved by legal claims today that are based on religious convictions if they're not part of the same religious community. The third parameter is that human dignity is a priority. And this is rather self-evident. What this means is that theology cannot be used to justify violence or oppression or injustice against Israelis, against Palestinians, against Jews, Muslims, or Christians, or pretty much against anyone. And that also must be factored into a theology or a theological approach to the land and state of Israel in the Catholic world. And finally, the Catholic Church affirms that the Jewish covenantal life with God is alive and well, and it never was revoked, and continues to bring spiritual richness to the Jewish people. Now, for theology, that means, for Catholic theology, it means that Jewish self-understanding about their covenantal attachment to the land of Israel has to be respected, and it ought to be considered in the development of Catholic theologies regarding the land and the state. Now, I want to mention also a related, concept or parameter in terms of international law, which is that recent popes, post-conciliar, post-Vatican II popes, including Pope Francis, John Paul II, and Benedict, have all said, and these are Francis's words here, that the state of Israel has every right to exist in safety and prosperity. So this also is part of the mix. Now, having said that, let me focus on one particular question. Can the spiritual centrality of the land of Israel for Jews that Ruth and Debbie so beautifully spoke about earlier, can that spiritual significance have religious meaning for Catholics? We may stand at a distance and sort of say, oh, that's really nice that Jews feel connected to the land, but does it have any spiritual meaning for Catholics and by extension for other Christians? I think at a very minimal level, at least, the answer has to be yes. The spiritual centrality of the land for Jews can be religiously significant for Catholics because the Vatican has taught, many bishops' conferences have taught, that we can be edified by Jewish covenantal life. We Christians, through dialogue, can be enriched and can understand our relationship with God better. Well, that must therefore also include, logically, Jewish attachment to the land of Israel. But that's a very vague and sort of nebulous answer. So I would like to suggest that there are probably at least three, very Trinitarian, approaches by which the land significance for Jews might also be meaningful for Catholics. The first such approach I'll call an ecological approach. And I take my lead here from something that Pope Francis wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si. He wrote, quote, "Human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the planet Earth itself." Now, that global reality could be understood as particularly embodied or instantiated in the Jewish covenantal experience of living in covenant with God, and therefore being part of connections among the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. That this particular relationship with God and land reflects what ought to be the case for the whole human race regarding the planet. And this is a particularly attractive approach to me because it inverts, it turns on its head a longstanding Christian polemic about Jewish attachment to the land. Jesper mentioned it in passing, which is that what's important is the universal, not the particular. And Christians have a universal approach and Jews have a narrow, even tribal approach, and that therefore is bad. Well, this approach would understand it more, the Jewish religious attachment to the land, as actually a model for how we all ought to be as human beings regarding the planet. A second approach could be called a sacramental approach. And here I would mention a book several years ago, also published by Paulus Press, by our colleague Richard Lux, The Jewish People, the Holy Land, the State of Israel, A Catholic View, in which he addressed the possibility of a sacramental approach. I'm going to take a slightly different understanding of the idea of sacramentality and would spell it out this way. The spiritual connection between Jews and the land of Israel could be seen as a sacrament of God's eternal covenantal fidelity to the children of Israel. Now, sacrament, of course, is something that mediates the divine presence or that mediates grace. And if it's possible for Catholics and other Christians to look at the love that Jews have for the land of Israel as modeling the love of God for Israel, that would be edifying spiritually for us. There is a caveat here, though, that in Catholic theology, events or experiences that mediate the divine or are sacramental in some ways, by their very nature, always reflect something about the life of the reign of God, or Olam Haba, the age to come, the Messianic age. There has to be a significance pointing toward the future reality of all things in Catholic sacramental theology. Well, this is currently hard to discern in the Middle East today, or in the land of Israel and Palestine today. The life of the reign to come, or the age to come, is obscured by the unrest and the violence and the continuing inequities that exist. So this is more of a possible approach theologically. And similar is the third approach that I'll call the covenantal restoration approach. By this I mean, could the return of Jews to self-governance in the land of Israel be meaningful religiously for Christians as an act of God restoring the covenanting Jewish people after disaster, after the long period of exile of which Ruth spoke in particular? By the way, for Christians, of course, we also have a model of covenantal restoration in the raising of Jesus from the dead, that the supremely faithful Son of Israel is raised by God into the life of the age to come. Now, again, there's a qualifier here. Since Revelation is relational, for Christians to see God at work in the birth of the state of Israel would require a decision of faith. It's not something that would be an obvious conclusion for everybody that observes the history since 1948. Everybody would agree, oh yes, this is an act of God. It requires a conscious decision on the part of observers to come to that point. And again, it's kind of difficult, for me at least, and I think for many Christians, to come to that decision when tranquility and peace are not present for everybody. So these are the three approaches that I see in Catholic theology various people are pursuing in different ways, and there is great hope for them in the future. With that, let me conclude by making a few points. Number one, Jewish religious attachment to the land of Israel may come to have spiritual meaning for Catholics. And indeed, I think it already is having spiritual meaning for Catholics, for some Catholics. For example, Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI wrote in a 2018 article that the founding of the state of Israel could express, quote, God's faithfulness to the people of Israel, end quote. He didn't develop this, he didn't expand upon what he was thinking, but it's an interesting resonance with some of the ideas that I was just discussing. Thirdly, the more the life of the age to come is seen in the land, the greater its positive impact on the world will be. Now, this could be said for almost any country or any people, but of course, the particular biblical significance of Israel for Jews, Christians, and Muslims adds to this potential impact. And lastly, number four, for the Catholic Church, achieving a just and viable political reality for the Palestinian people and for their prosperity is absolutely vital. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
So let me start by thanking all of our speakers. And as I had said at the start, we were going to spend some time having questions, discussions between our speakers before opening up for your questions. And I thought I would take the prerogative of the moderator to ask a question that I think would be directed to any of our speakers, but follows up on something that a number of people had said. A number of you had spoken, I think, helpfully about the diversity within religious traditions, within these religious traditions. Even the titles of the last three presentations use the term theologies, not simply theology, but saying Jewish theologies. And I want to see if anyone would like to say something about how the main views or the trends, say something about the main views or trends in these traditions over time, that is, especially since 1948. I'd be curious to hear from our speakers about what it is that has waxed or waned as different positions, to understand the diversity, say today, what positions existed as prominent in the past and seem to be either growing or weakening, and why that might be the case. For example, distance from the Shoah or closeness to the Shoah, military or political events. And so I'd welcome anyone who wanted to speak about this sort of historical trajectory that might be occurring in the different traditions that contribute to diversity.
I would make one comment. I think that one of the disturbing trends within Jewish approaches is that the term Zionism, which not only in 1948, but in the 60s and 70s, represented a very broad spectrum of perspectives on the land and on the state and on the relationship between the Jewish people and other nations. I think that spectrum has been narrowing over the past few decades and has begun to be identified with certain rather rigid political positions. Personally, I find that very disturbing. So I would say that this diversity and pluralism that we've been talking about seems, at least within the Jewish community, to be more narrow than it used to be.
Yeah, other thoughts?
I would say it's a co-opting of the word Zionism. And I mean, there are certainly Israelis who claim to be anti-Zionist because especially because Zionism has come to represent such lack of space for the Palestinian community. But at the same time, I think that if that co-option had not happened, most of those folks would probably be quite comfortable with the language, with some aspects of the language of Zionism. But of course, our whole world has shifted, and particularly the whole question of whether people can migrate from one place to another legitimately, the language of colonialism, which is condemnatory language today. All of these things shift the ways, the meanings and the weights that different words have. That people who claim to be anti-Zionist are still very much at home in Israel as Jews, suggests that at some level, even though they're not identifying with the term, that there is something that is in continuity with which brought probably their ancestors to make life in the land. So yeah, I think that with Adam, to go to your question, we're dealing with a constantly shifting map. And it's part of this constant tension between aspirations and dreams and what they are, which has variety to it, and the shifting realities. What's enforced on the Jewish reality by lack of openings for peace. That forces a lot of people into uncomfortable positions, positions they'd rather not be in. And so the dreams, I think, have some constancy, although degree to which people are identified with religious tradition and educated about it, of course, is another whole huge spectrum which shapes this whole thing.
I would welcome any of the panelists to ask questions either of each other or just in general. So David, yeah, please.
I'd like to make 3 comments that I think take us into a more profound dialogue. 2 of them touch on images. And again, we're friends, we know each other for years. So I say it without any intention to wound anybody, but to really open up perspective. I want to relate first to a slide that was used by Ruth, and she used it in order to say, in Israel, there are magnificent private homes. The image was of a Palestinian home where the residents had been chased out, most likely, if it is today an Israeli Jewish home. And here again, we get back to touching the absolutely pulsating ambiguity of celebrating or mourning the existence in the land. I want to do the same with the slide that was used right at the end of Phil's presentation, which showed a mass of young Israelis carrying flags. It's called the March of the Flags, and going into Damascus Gate. Now, I think that for many of us who live in Israel, even Jewish Israelis, I think that Debbie would be one of them. I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm just imagining that she is. We mourn that. That is pogrom-like. Every year it repeats itself, and Palestinians cower in their homes as that march takes place. So I think, again, we need all of us to become more and more sensitive to the polyvalent meanings of what we are presenting. And that takes me to one last comment, and that is to do with Phil's 3 points about how it's possible to see positively the Jewish connection with the land. I don't think that too many people I know, even on the Palestinian side, have any problem at all, Christians and Muslims, with the Jewish attachment to the land. We can hear that, we can respect it. We have a problem with the state that is called Jewish, a state that is very deliberately and clearly not the state of all its citizens. It's with that we have the problem, and from there is born the 2 realities that make the last 73 years of statehood very, very, very problematic. And those are the realities of occupation. Let's remember that even within the state of Israel until January 1966, the citizens of Israel who are Palestinian Arab lived under military occupation. And when that finally ended on the 1st of January 1966, a few months later, a year and a half later, we had the reality of the occupation of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And of course, the reality of discrimination. So again, I think that things need to be made clear. The people of Israel, I don't think that anyone should have a problem with that. The attachment of that people to the land of Israel, I would very much promote that and do teaching in Arabic in different places in the Arab world and in Palestine. But when it comes to the state of Israel and this 73 years, I'm not talking about the dream of what the state might be, but the lived reality of what the state has been for the last 73 years, it's there that makes everything so incredibly complex. Thanks.
And I would just encourage our listeners to please submit questions. And yeah, Phil.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to Adam's question and sort of fold in some of David's comments as well. You had asked, Adam, has there been a development in particular traditions over time, and have things shifted and so on? And I would venture to say, first of all, that the Catholic world, although it may appear monolithic to non-Catholics, it's not. There is diversity of opinion within Catholicism. That is not just what we could call ideological or theological or right and left or that kind of thing, but it's also geographic. And so Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document that turned around everything, I'll just assert that as a given. It took decades to begin to unpack the full significance or the potential significances of that turnaround in Catholic understanding. And one of the arenas or one of the aspects of that turnaround that people will remember in the 1970s, the 1980s, when I spoke before Jewish congregations or Christian Jewish congregations, inevitably a question would come up: when is the Vatican going to recognize the state of Israel? When is it going to establish diplomatic relations? And there is all kinds of, I'm not interested in exploring that question, why it took until 1993. My point is to show that this was something that Jews generally were really interested in, and Catholics, it was sort of on the back burner. Right? It wasn't a big pressing issue, although as time went on, it of course needed to become so. And of course, we factored into that is the experience of Nostra Aetate of Palestinian Christians is really quite different than the experience of Nostra Aetate of folks living in Europe or the North America or other parts of the world. And that's part of what David was pointing to, that how one grapples with this changed reality in terms of Catholic understanding of Jews is not an instantaneous process, and it's going to unfold very, very differently in different parts of the world, perhaps most difficultly, if I could put it that way, or with the most angst in terms of the situation of Palestinian Christians, and also of Eastern Orthodox Christians who are living in those lands, who of course are not, Nostra Aetate is not authoritative for them in the same way, but nonetheless, it has an impact. And that was one of the reasons why I focused my article in the book and my remarks here today on the question of, can the Jewish religious attachment to the land, which David notes is something that's positive and can be affirmed by Christians, but can it inform our own spirituality? That was where I was going with my discussion. I think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's an obvious yes for various reasons that I tried to enunciate.
Do we have time for more? If we do,
Please.
So I want to disagree on one point with my very dear friend David, who's been very generous to me in this discussion. My experience in dialogue with Palestinians, and here I would say particularly Muslims, but some Christians as well, is that they do not appreciate the Jewish connection with the land, and specifically with Jerusalem. Sometimes they question the whole notion of Jewish peoplehood. So while I agree with you that the state is really the elephant in the room that we have to talk about and deal with, I think that on issues of our connection with the land, there are also some serious questions that mean that we need more and more dialogue.
All right, any more responses to the other panelists or questions? Okay, so why don't we look at some of the questions that have been submitted, and I encourage you again to please do so. So this is a question for Debbie. So, there's a prominent right-wing Israeli religious bloc. Is there a left-wing religious bloc?
There is, but it's too small to be called a bloc. I don't know what the term would be. I happen to be a member of a Jewish religious peace movement called Oz V'Shalom, Strength and Peace. And there are other such groups, but we are a minority within a minority. What I did say, though, is if you widen the definition of religious to include other streams of Judaism, which I would, we will have a native Israeli born and bred Reform rabbi in the Knesset as of next month, if the polls are correct.
And has there been change over time in the influence or size of the left-wing religious community?
Well, again, if you're talking about within Orthodoxy, there really hasn't.
Okay.
But if you include conservative, reform, and sort of secular traditional, yes, those movements have grown.
Okay, great. I think this is probably for Ruth. So how have American Jews' views changed over time on these questions?
How have American Jews' views have, that's also not a simple question. Depends where you're asking within the American Jewish community, but I think the most complex is at the liberal end of the Jewish spectrum, where in the early years of Zionism, up until the founding of the state, there was a lot of ambivalence or negativity to this threatening to the position, what seemed to be a threatening to the position of diaspora Jews in their diaspora countries as full citizens and not having divided loyalties and so on and so forth. Once the state was founded, American Jews became much more supportive of the state pretty well across the board. There are exceptions to that, but the main movements of American Reform Conservative Orthodox Judaism all eventually integrated, if they didn't have integrated already, aspects of Zionism into their teachings, even the Reform movement in the 1990s. And indeed, the platform that they developed in the 1990s as the first Reform Zionist platform is one of the documents that we give in the back of the book as a document to read as part of coming to understand the development of, in this case, Jewish understandings of the land of Israel. But we're now 25, 30 years after that 25, I think it is, years after that document. And we are living in a world in which there's now a young generation of Jews who don't really have a sense of relationship to Israel and who are also extremely bothered by the situation of Palestinians. And so this has created yet another dynamic in this shifting scene. So we have Jews in America who are, Israel is right no matter what it does. And we have Jews in America who have troubles creating a emotional attachment with the land in any sense.
Great. I think this probably goes to David, and it's asking, I think, for an elaboration of some of what you said already, which is the experience of Christians in the land of Israel, land and state of Israel, which I would sort of formulate as in many ways sort of a historical reversal in two ways. That is, Christians now find themselves a minority and Jews find themselves a majority. Those are sort of characteristically the opposite has been in history. And I wonder if you could say some more about the experience of Christians in Israel, particularly with things like political influence, political representation, perhaps culturally. They even noticed in broader discussions about Israeli society.
Okay, so I'll take up the question of representation because I want to make it very, very clear that Christians as Christians do not have political claims or desire political representation. What we desire as Christians is to be an integral part of the societies in which we live, because the two political realities are Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs, and Christians, very interestingly, are an integral part of both realities. We have in the state of Israel today three major groups of Christians. We have the Palestinian Arabs who have always been there. They have been there since the founding of Christianity. Okay, then we have Hebrew-speaking Israeli Christians who are not Arabs and are part and parcel of Israeli society. And then we have a third reality with which I am very connected, and that is long-term residents who are migrant workers and asylum seekers who have no status at all. And that is a whole different subject, which is a real stain on a modern state that claims to be democratic. Now, I go back to the question of representation. We don't want representation. We want complete equality, whether it is in Palestine or whether it is in Israel or whether it is anywhere in the Arab world. We do not want to live in states where we are made to feel excluded because the state defines itself as Sharia law state, Muslim state, or as a Jewish state in any form. We want complete equality. And I think it's important to note that there are Christians in the Knesset, but they do not identify themselves as Christians. They identify themselves with the nationality that they hold. In most cases, I think in all cases at present, they are Palestinian Arabs who are struggling against occupation and for equality.
Jesper, can I direct a question at you? The question is, I think, could be directed at numerous Christian sort of represents different perspectives, but I do wonder if you might say something, particularly from a European perspective, which you bring a important perspective on, how European Protestant churches have thought about Jewish peoplehood and secular Jews. That is, how have they conceived of sort of Jews either in a kind of corporate sense or as a religious grouping, and has that been a challenge?
I think the starting point for that line of thought would be that the definition in European history, philosophy, theology has been a very Protestant one, that religion is a way of talking and not so much a way of walking. So the definition is not, it seldom includes a possibility of halakha or sharia, but rather it's a way of freedom of speech. And therefore, emphasis, I believe, has been much more on the religious definition of being a Jew. So generally speaking, we only have a few minutes now towards the end of this session, that it hasn't been really a theological room, theological space for someone who wants to live a non-Christian life, a non-Protestant life in Protestant countries and vice versa. So therefore, I think that it could be improved a lot, the way that one thinks of Jews were described in Sweden as people of Mosaic belief, that they believed in Moses as Christians believe in Jesus of Nazareth. And Muslims were called Mohammedans because they believed in Muhammad in the same way as Protestants believed in Jesus of Nazareth. And therefore the very way of talking about, if I may say so, the theological, demographic, religious minority, it was very much according one's own understanding of what religion is. That religion is, as T.S. Eliot says, a way of talking and a way of walking.
I have a question that I think really anyone who has spent a lot of time in Israel perhaps might be able to answer. And it builds off a comment that Ruth had made about the clearing out of part of the area in front of the Western Wall to expand it to include sort of room for kind of outdoor. I think the phrase, at least that the questioner used here, is outdoor synagogue. I don't know if that's the one you used, Ruth, but I wonder if really anyone, this is really anyone who has some knowledge of this, might say something about the way in which, say, the physical layout of Jerusalem has changed. The way the city, say, used to be versus is now. What's changed to reflect religious ideas behind sort of how the city should be? Using this example here of sort of making the Western Wall a bigger place for Jewish worship. Are there other changes that have taken place in the city, or I guess for that matter, the country, but thinking of Jerusalem, that reflect these sort of religious ideas? Yeah, David, please.
So unfortunately, we don't have a long time to debate this, but this is, of course, an enormous painful aspect of the conquest of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem in 1967. But of course, it begins in 1948 with the conquest of West Jerusalem. And I think that the trend is a very clear one. And again, there are those that celebrate and those that are broken and catastrophized by this process. And it's what is called making Jerusalem a Jewish city, which, let me stress, it is. And let me stress, in part, so that making it again a Jewish city could be celebrated by those who really do appreciate that Jerusalem for Jews is a very important place. But that has come at the price of making Jerusalem a lot less Muslim and a lot less Christian. And so here again, it's this pain of being torn in a wounded land, being torn in a wounded city, where today Muslims and Christians are pushed aside to make more space for Jews. And that's also the case of what happened in the plaza in front of the Western Wall.
Yeah, thank you, David. Any other thoughts on that?
I would just add to that, I'm not going to dispute what David just said, that we have, speaking as an American, we have an ideal in America of integration and of people actually living together. I don't think we live up to that ideal. Our cities are still extremely segregated, but one, as an American who has spent time in Israel, one is really struck also by the degree to which Israel is a very segregated society. And that's true even within Jewish society. There are neighborhoods of Jewish neighborhoods in the whole country and in Jerusalem, maybe even more so, where I would not be comfortable living, either because they are too secular or because they are too religious. I choose when I go to Jerusalem to live in Debbie's neighborhood. And we actually sit next to each other when I show up. I come and sit next to Debbie in synagogue when we can actually attend synagogue. But one feels, the first time that I was in Jerusalem for the year that I was there with my husband, we made the wrong choice of neighborhood. And we were outsiders in many, many ways. And that's true. So it's true internally in Israeli society on all sorts of ideological, especially religious bases. And it's then also all the more true between national groups, which are religiously defined as well. So yeah, the French Jews stick together, the Anglo Jews stick together, those of us who speak English. But all the more so, we stick together as Jews, and there are other neighborhoods which are Palestinian neighborhoods. And so that part of needs to be understood as part of the reality of how this country functions. And I'm not sure that there's a solution to that in the near future.
Debbie?
Two of the least segregated facets of our life, which is partly why I like them so much. The first one is the light rail in Jerusalem that I love to ride for many reasons, one of which is that it's not segregated and that you literally rub elbows with all kinds of people who happen to be taking public transportation. And the second is the medical care system, and especially I don't know what they're called, like HMOs, but they're bigger, I think, that give out the vaccinations. And that's another place that is totally not segregated and works well. And I think that we should learn from that segregation is a bad idea, doesn't work well. And if we want an enriched society, and of course a more just society, then we have to be more integrated.
So if I could conclude with a plug for our book and build off something that Ruth had said about the sort of challenge of being in a different place, the idea of sort of entering a different space and how it's kind of hard to do that. One of the things we've tried to do with the book is to expose people to a diversity of viewpoints and really ask them to kind of have an open mind towards it, particularly with our curriculum, where we ask people to sort of put aside the views they bring with them and to try to hear the other. And that's hard to do. Anyhow, we very much appreciate your joining us today. I want to thank our speakers who really did a fine job on a very difficult topic. So thank you so much. And thank you as well to the ICCJ for their support in organizing this webinar today. So have a good whatever comes next in your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.